My name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This evening's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This evening, it is our pleasure to host Musa al-Gharbi. Musa is a sociologist and an assistant professor of communication and journalism at Stony Brook University. Beyond his scholarly work, Dr. al-Gharbi is deeply committed to engaging with the public and institutional stakeholders on his domains of expertise. His work has been cited by a number of governmental and other organizations, including the Department of State, the Army War College, and the Council on Foreign Relations, among others. He has consulted with nonprofits, corporate executives, and policymakers in the US and abroad. He is regularly tapped by journalists and media organizations to discuss current events, to include spots with NPR, CNN, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, Voice of America, and others. Musa is also the author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. There you have it, yes. Princeton University Press. That's the title he is here to present tonight. We Have Never Been Woke, as the publisher describes it, details how the language of social justice is increasingly used to justify the elite and to portray the losers in the knowledge economy as deserving their lot because they think or say the wrong things about race, gender, and sexuality. Al-Gharbi's point is not to accuse symbolic capitalists of hypocrisy or cynicism. Rather, he examines how their genuine beliefs prevent them from recognizing how they contribute to social problems, so that their actions regularly provoke backlash against the social justice causes they champion. A powerful critique, We Have Never Been Woke, reveals that only by challenging this elite's self-serving narratives can we hope to address social and economic inequality effectively. Thanks also to Labyrinth Books for being with us this evening to support this event. They'll be selling copies of Musa's book, and I understand that he's willing to join us for a signing as well. Thank you. So to discuss his new book, Musa is joined by Shamus Khan, who is Willard Thorpe Professor of Sociology and American Studies at Princeton University. He writes on culture, inequality, gender, and elites. He is the author of over 100 articles, books, and essays, including Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, The Practice of Research, Approaches to Ethnography, Modes of Representation and Analysis and Participant Observation, and Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus, which was named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR. He was a co-principal investigator of SHIFT, a multi-year study of sexual health and sexual violence at Columbia University. He writes regularly for the popular press such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and has served as a columnist for Time magazine. Finally, this program also brings into focus a topic which the library's Public Humanities Initiative is prioritizing this year, and that is namely justice. Throughout 2025, the programming team at the library will be exploring justice from multiple perspectives and through the intersecting textures of our dense social fabric. This thematic programming was launched in January with a panel discussion on history and restorative justice in Princeton, and we continue exploring areas of social justice with tonight's program. Looking ahead, I'd be remiss not to highlight as well a few other programs of interest, namely the Feminist Book Discussion Group, which returns on April 7th at 6 p.m., and a Catherine Project book group exploring fundamental texts related to justice, which will launch later in April on the 15th. So all of that said, I think I'll hand it over now to Shamus, and thank you also for being here, and let's thank our guests.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here, part of this conversation. I want to thank the Princeton Public Library for putting together this and so many incredible events for us as a community. Again, thanks to Labyrinth for being here to have the book, and you should buy a copy of the book if you're able, or get it out in the library.
5% commission.
And finally, I want to thank Musa for being here in Princeton with us today. Earlier today, he gave a talk in the department, which was wonderful, and it's nice to be in conversation with you this evening. So I thought I would just start by bringing us all up to speed on what the book is about. So what's the kind of core argument of this book, We Have Never Been Woke?
So the we in We Have Never Been Woke is this constellation of elites that I call symbolic capitalists. I call them symbolic capitalists because we make a living mostly on kind of what we know, who we know, and how we're known. That is by kind of cultivating and leveraging what this other sociologist called symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people. So a less nerdy way of understanding who symbolic capitalists are to think about people who work in fields like journalism, HR, academia, consulting, finance, law, science and technology, and so on. People who make a living by manipulating goods and, by manipulating ideas and rhetoric and data and things like this instead of providing physical goods and services to people. Okay, so what's interesting about symbolic capitalists? Well, there's a bunch of things that are interesting about them, but one thing that's interesting about symbolic capitalists is that from the beginning of a lot of our professions, we've defined ourselves in terms of altruism and serving the common good. So to use my own professions, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power, to be a voice for the voiceless, to educate citizens, to be good participants in democracy. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone's political or economic interests. These kinds of altruistic aspirations define the professions from the beginning. And if you look today, contemporary symbolic capitalists are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party. We overwhelmingly self-identify as liberal. We're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, as feminists, as allies to LGBTQ people, as environmentalists, and so on. And so what you might expect, given this deep commitment to egalitarianism, given the ways that we define ourselves and so on, is that as people like us gained more power and status in society, you might expect to see inequality shrinking, longstanding social problems getting fixed, growing trust in institutions because of all the great work that we're doing. And what I show in the book is that over the last 50 years, there have been these important changes to the global economy that have led to symbolic capitalists having a lot more power and influence than ever before. But the consequences of that shift have been very far from what we might expect. Instead, we see over the last 50 years, as we've gained in power and influence, we've been seeing growing inequalities, growing affective polarization, increasing institutional dysfunction, increasing mistrust of institutions. And so kind of the core puzzle the book is trying to wrestle with is like, what's going on here? Why is that? Why do we see the world we actually live in instead of the world that we might have hoped or expected, the world that, in fact, earlier generations of symbolic capitalists promised, that if people like us were given more power and influence, that we'd see all of these good things. They haven't really materialized, even though we have gotten more power and influence. So that's kind of the core question, the core puzzle the book is wrestling with.
So let me push you a little bit on this, because, two things happen together. It doesn't mean one explains the other, right? So you basically told me that, there's a bunch of people, symbolic capitalists, who are getting more powerful, and that as they've gotten more powerful, inequality has increased. But I would say, well, a different counterfactual would be if other people had been in power, maybe inequality would have increased a lot faster, or maybe there would have been a lot more inequality. So I'm curious, what are the things that symbolic capitalists are doing that you think are driving this inequality?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I think are important to context for understanding some of these trends. One of them is that increasingly institutions of knowledge production, like colleges and universities, serve this important role in shaping whose perspectives are worth taking seriously, are worth engaging with, which perspectives are worth, and the fact that the distribution of these credentials across society is not evenly distributed, but in fact kind of tracks along the lines of class, geography, race, and so on, is part of the reason why, even though there's less overt discrimination along the lines of race and gender and so on today, we actually haven't seen a lot of progress in terms of racialized inequalities, because we're no longer overtly discriminating against people on race. We're discriminating on people based on credentials, but credentials are also track along the lines of a lot of these racialized inequalities. And so part of it, and actually, okay, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I'll go on a brief tangent.
Yeah.
So Because there's this essay that haunts me. It haunts me, like I think about it all the time. It's by this guy, Bertrand Cooper. It's called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And what Cooper argues in this article is that if George Floyd, after George Floyd was murdered, there were all these specials about him on HBO, on CNN, on everywhere, and unending articles about George Floyd and his life. Nancy Pelosi took a knee with the kente cloth, and all these, Chuck Schumer. And so what Cooper asks is, imagine a world in which George Floyd hadn't been killed. Imagine a world in which he just lived his life that day, didn't encounter the police, but he wanted to write for the New York Times or the Atlantic or any of these other people that care about him so much and talk about him incessantly. Would he be able to write for these outlets? And the answer, of course, is no, because George Floyd doesn't have a college degree, and people in the NPR, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and all these other outlets, frankly, don't really care what people like George Floyd think or feel about anything. Their perspectives are completely absent from all of these outlets. And in fact, when we're sometimes forced to confront the inconvenient views of people like George Floyd, we sometimes shoot the messenger who delivered us the kind of inconvenient views of someone like George Floyd. And so there's something perverse about the fact that, we started caring about George Floyd because he was killed in public and became a symbol that we could manipulate in our struggles over power and status. That's when we started caring about George Floyd. But a world in which that didn't happen, we wouldn't have known George Floyd from Adam, cared about him one whit, the perspectives of people like him absent. And so this is one of these aspects in which college degrees and these credentials from these knowledge economy institutions, especially from elite institutions like Princeton and Columbia, play this important role in kind of shaping who matters in society. And so this is one of the ways in which we've seen, it's not just incidental that we have these knowledge economy professionals and we have inequality, but literally the way that we structure these institutions and use these institutions to allocate resources and prestige and things like this to mark people as being worthy of elite lives or even middle class lives or not, is one of the core drivers of a lot of contemporary inequalities.
So as I'm understanding it, you're claiming that these symbolic capitalists claim to speak for, give voice to minoritized or marginalized people. People like George Floyd, trans people today who are experiencing some oppression, women, ethnic minorities, et cetera, migrants, the undocumented. But what you're arguing is partially that they are, in fact, mobilizing this rhetoric in their own interest, and that frequently they don't actually speak in the interest of those people. This leads me to two questions. The first is, what is the interest of the symbolic capitalist in doing this? And why is that not aligned with, or what is the interest of the people? I gave you kind of a lot of people to think about, but just pick one group, pick one group.
Pick a group.
Pick a group. What is that group's interest? And why can't they, or why don't they actually speak in that interest?
Yeah, so, okay, I'll go in kind of reverse order. So, no, okay, I'll go in the original order. Final answer. All right, so one of the reasons, one of the core puzzles the book is trying to explore is this, of all the ways that this new elite formation could justify itself, could legitimize its grabs for power and opportunity and resources, why on earth do they use these claims about social justice as their primary means of legitimation and competition? And the story I tell is in part because it's a historically contingent story. So, as I mentioned it before at the beginning of these professions, we justified, so people who work in fields like higher ed and journalism and stuff, compared to most other workers in society, we have a lot more pay than most other people. We have a lot more autonomy than most other people. We have a lot more social prestige than most other workers. And from the beginning of our professions, we said the reason you should give us these things, the reason you should give us this autonomy, this pay, this prestige, and so on, is not for our own sake. No, never for us. But because if you give us this, if you empower us in this way, it will enable us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us. And so from the beginning of our professions, claims for like power and status and resources and prestige and deference and so on, they've been bound up with these claims that we make about altruism and the common good, and especially with helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged. And for a century now, as I show in the book, this isn't something that just started with Twitter. For a century now, it's been the case that within the symbolic professions, people who are especially effective at presenting themselves as serving the common good, as being allies of the marginalized and the disadvantaged, of having the right kind of morals and the right kinds of delivering the goods and so on, are seen as being especially worthy of power and status and deference and so on. And the people who are successfully painted as having the wrong values or being in bed with the wrong people or thinking the wrong kinds of thoughts about the wrong kind of people, they've found their position in the symbolic professions jeopardized or could even lose their jobs. And this has been a case in these professions for a century now. It's not something new. And so it's partly an accident, like a historically contingent fact that at the beginning of these professions, we kind of justified these grabs for power and status by appealing to social justice, and that created this kind of unique form of status competition within the professions that persists to this day. And that shifted even more after things like the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action stuff. I could go into that, but I'll bracket that. And then the second part of the question.
What are the interests of the people that they, if they actually did what they purported to do, what would they be doing instead? Or what would they be saying instead? What would they be expressing instead?
So I think, one of the challenges that symbolic capitalists have faced also for a century now, so George Orwell, writing in the 30s, has this book called The Road to Wigan Pier, which you should check out, but buy mine first. What he argues in The Road to Wigan Pier is that a lot of knowledge economy professionals, thought of themselves as advocates for the working man, for the working class, but these professionals basically had absolutely no connection, no organic connection with the working class communities, with working class jobs. They didn't know much at all about the experiences and travails of working class people. And in fact, whenever they met these people that they were champions of in the abstract, whenever they had the misfortune of running across these people IRL, they immediately kind of recoiled in horror at the boorish, at their manners, at their values, at their politics, and immediately tried to micromanage and correct them and stuff like that, which engendered resentment by working class people against the professions. And so a lot of the dynamics that we see today, again, have been present for like a century in the symbolic professions. And so one of the challenges that a lot of knowledge economy professionals face when we're trying to advocate for the marginalized and the disadvantaged in society is just that we really don't have a good understanding of what the people we're trying to help actually value, what they want, what they need. And when we try to figure out, what do Black people want? We don't usually conduct or consult nationally representative surveys to try to understand Black public opinion. We often also don't go out into the community and just interview a lot of local stakeholders about what they want. What we tend to do is go, okay, let me see what the Black columnists at the New York Times think about blah. And the problem with doing that is that a lot of the spokespeople in outlets like the New York Times and so on, they're just demonstrably not representative of the groups that they purport to represent. And they're often not aware of the gap themselves. Like they believe themselves to be more representative than they are, and so they often make claims on behalf of these groups that when you consult things like polling, when you do consult things like polling or you go into communities and interview people, it turns out that a lot of the people they're purporting to represent just don't want those things.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Like a good low-hanging fruit might relate to things like criminal justice, like a lot of policies that were advocated in the name of criminal justice. So So one thing that's important to note about Black public opinion, if you consult nationally representative polls and surveys and so on, is that Black people in America do have significant concerns about the criminal justice system. They do have significant concerns about policing. They think that, they want better policing, but they don't necessarily want less policing. They actually typically want the same amount or more, just better policing. And part of the reason they have that view is because although it's, on the one hand, it's definitely true that black people disproportionately suffer at the hands of over-policing, the mass incarceration system, and so on, they're also hugely disproportionately the primary victims of crime. They have real concerns about public safety and public order that are often being insufficiently addressed. And for a lot of us, things like property crime. So oftentimes in symbolic capitalist spaces, when I talk to people about criminal, because I previously had subscribed to the same position that I'm now critiquing until I started consulting the nationally representative survey data and some other stuff like this. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe I don't understand the interests of the people I'm trying to represent. And rather than just assuming they don't know their own interests, maybe I should just take seriously the fact that I don't know their interests. Property crime. One of the things you often hear is like, oh, well, if someone steals something or vandalizes something, that's just stuff. It can be fixed, it can be replaced. Like, why would you want to sick the police on someone like that, give them the scarlet letter that sticks with them for the rest of their life, possibly risk their lives in some altercation with the police? It's just stuff. People can't be replaced. Stuff can be replaced. Now, that's a convenient position. Like, for people in a position like mine, it's easy to adopt a kind of lackadaisical attitude towards things like that. Like, so for instance, if someone stole my bike, that would suck. I have a pretty nice bike, it's sweet. But at the end of the day, if someone stole my bike, it would be super inconvenient, but I just buy a new bike. But if you use your bike to get to work and it's your primary mode of transportation and someone steals your bike, that's a big problem for you. In order to get, you probably don't have, if you're a working class or lower class person and someone steals your bike, you probably don't just have the money to just go buy a new bike. And in order to get the money to buy a new bike, you have to get to work, which you use the bike to do. And so you have to figure out how to kind of rework your whole thing. And then even if you eventually scrounge up the money to buy a new bike, that's money you're not spending on other things, on your children, on your rent, on your utilities, on your other bills and stuff. And so the things like property crime can be hugely disruptive for people who are less affluent. And so for people who are more affluent, we often look at things like property crime and go, pshaw, pshaw. But it's not. It's a big problem for people who live in less affluent communities and things like this. And so this is one of those ways in which, just because we have these different sets of risk exposures, these different sets of life experiences and stuff like this, it's sometimes hard for us to conceptualize the actual needs and priorities of the people we're trying to advocate for, that in ways that sometimes lead us to minimize problems that are in fact very severe for the people that we're trying to assist and help.
I mean, some of what it seems you're describing is an increased segregation between different kinds of groups in society. I'll get back to that, but I want to talk about the title for a moment. Like, we have never been woke, and I want to ask you about this word woke, right? Because woke is the kind of word, at least for me, like, what does it mean? In many instances, it's just like a catch-all word to insult some person for thinking something rather foolish, or for having a kind of disposition. And so I'm curious both what you mean by woke and what you think the word woke is doing, sort of more generally, because the book is about symbolic capitalists, and yet it uses this term that many of them would be like deeply offended by, or that would think that as it gets thrown out, it's actually a kind of dismissive accusation of the things they're interested in.
Yeah. So one thing that I don't do in the book is provide a kind of dictionary-style definition of the term, to the annoyance of some. But the reason I don't do that.
Was I annoyed by that?
But the reason I don't do that is for a bunch of reasons. One, I think people over-focus on definitions sometimes at the expense of substance. So I teach interpersonal communication at Stony Brook. One of the things that I do when we cover language is I'll have my students, I'll say, all right, students, you're 30 bright people at an R1 research university. This shouldn't be hard at all. Please define apple for me. Provide me the necessary and sufficient conditions that include 100% of apples, that exclude everything else. Don't give me a tautological definition like genus, species, because that's just saying apple is apple. But give me a substantive definition of apple. And I'll sit there with 20 minutes, 30 kids, or bright kids, and it turns out none of them can define the term apple in a way that satisfies those conditions. But that doesn't mean that they don't know what apples are. And so if I ask them, hey, give me an apple, they're going to come back with a fish or a chair. It's just not the case that you need to provide these kinds of dictionary-style necessary and sufficient conditions to use a word properly. Properly means you use a word, it's being understood by the person that you're using it for, and so they get your meaning. Okay, so that's true of just banal terms like apple. We often use these terms without actually being able to define them. Now, when you're talking about a highly contentious term that's kind of intimately bound up with the culture wars and so on, then it's even tougher to provide a definition, because oftentimes the ways that people define that kind of a term in itself kind of bakes in a bunch of moral and political positions. Like, you'll define woke a certain way if you're on the right versus if you're on the left. And so rather than just kind of picking a side in that, what I tried to do is surface the way different stakeholders have understood and used the word over time. So in chapter 1 of the book, I kind of look at the history of the term. I look at how other words that served a similar function in the past, like political correctness, like in the late 80s to early 90s, the last time we had a big blow up like this, political correctness was the term instead of woke. And actually, last thing I'll say on this, political correctness is actually a really instructive case about the trajectory of woke. So it used to be the case that people would understand themselves to be PC or politically correct. They would use the term in an unironic way to mean my moral and political views are correct. Okay. But there started to be this schism within the left about political correctness, where some people in the left continued to use the term to mean my moral and political views are correct. Other people on the left started associating political correctness with a kind of sanctimonious, purely symbolic style of politics, symbols over substance. Eventually, this dispute within the left got picked up by the right, and they started using the PC and political correctness as this kind of catch-all cudgel to attack anything they didn't like. Anything right of center was branded PC nonsense and whatever. And even the term politically incorrect started to get this positive valence. You had people like Bill Maher, who had a show called Politically Incorrect, And you can see a similar thing happening with wokeness. So the term woke was originally used in left circles to, it went through a bunch of iterations, but in almost all iterations, it signified an awareness of social problems and a commitment to doing something about them, basically. And then there came to be this dispute within the left about wokeness in the same way as politically correct. Eventually, the right seized on this dispute within the left and now uses woke as a way of insulting anything they don't like. In fact, there was this great survey that I talk about in the book where they interviewed Americans, they surveyed Americans and asked, well, what do you think about woke, the term woke? Do you have positive or negative feelings about it? Most Americans felt positively predisposed about woke and wokeness and so on at that time. Maybe different results today, who knows? But anyway, at that time, most Americans felt positively about it. And then they asked a follow-up question. Okay, if someone called you woke, would you understand that to be a compliment or an insult? And despite the fact that most Americans at that time had positive associations with woke, they understood that if someone used that word to refer to them, it would almost certainly be an insult. Overwhelmingly, Americans, even though they felt positively about the term, understood that the use of the term would be an insult. And so woke has kind of followed a similar trajectory. Now, the reason I wanted to put it in the title is because, books are products of particular times and circumstances. And in this current period of awakening, of this current period of contestation around social justice and so on, there's basically no term that was kind of more central to these discussions about social justice and identity and inequality and so on than the term woke. So I really wanted to foreground that, to lean into the contested nature of the term. And again, I spent a lot of time in the first chapter unpacking how different stakeholders have used the term over time and mobilized it and towards what ends and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the title is also a very interesting reference to this other book written 40-something years ago now, We Have Never Been Modern, which is a critique of the idea that we're rational people and that these sort of modern principles rule our lives.
Yeah.
I think, the book it's extremely interesting in that it is not an indictment of the ideology of justice. And so to return to the kind of theme of this conversation within the library, I think, the one way to read the book is when you see the title is like, oh, it's making fun of people with a commitment to social justice, or it's like saying look how these people are basically not really committed to the thing that they're doing, or that the thing that they're doing is invaluable. It strikes me that the argument that you're making is that there's something valuable to, I won't call it wokeness, but a commitment to justice, equality, and a commitment to understanding people's points of view when you decide to make policies. And that the people who purport to do this the most not just fail at it, but they may make things worse.
Yeah.
So that leads me to just my final question, and then we'll open it up to a conversation with the audience, is like, so what should they do? Like if we could wave a wand somehow and we could say, well, instead of the current rhetoric that's coming out of, not just the New York Times and the Atlantic, but also the Wall Street Journal and a range of publications, instead of what they're currently saying and doing, what are the sets of things that you think would be necessary to actually advance the kind of world that you would want to live in? Would it mean the end of symbolic capitalists? Would it mean thinking more about symbolic capitalism as a system? What would be kind of a vision for the future? Or a different way of putting this is like, if this audience out here should walk away from this book talk and be like, okay, so we shouldn't be woke in this symbolic capitalist way, like what should we be? Or what are the sets of things that we should do to try and achieve what our moral commitments are, et cetera, then the thing that you say has been kind of a failure and exacerbating the problems that people do have a deep moral commitment in wanting to actually solve.
Yeah. And so 2 quick points. Yeah. So first, this point about sincere commitments, I think is very important. So oftentimes in kind of the discourse, we have this kind of bifurcation that I think is unhelpful, where we think either people are using something to advance their interests or they're sincere. And so if you can show that someone is, has an interest in believing or professing something, then we go, ha, 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 therefore you must not mean it. You must be cynical or insincere. I think that's a terrible way to think about thinking for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which being there's a lot of research in the cognitive and behavioral sciences that shows that how we perceive and think about the world at a very fundamental level is oriented towards advancing our interests and furthering our goals. Okay, I'll make this slightly less nerdy. Like, so for instance, right now, right at this moment, I'm presented with this whole barrage of information. I can keep track of how many people in the audience have white shirts, how many people have brown hair, how many people have glasses or not, how many ceiling tiles there are, how many, I am presented with this barrage of information. I can't attend to it all. I have to make choices about what to focus on, about what to remember, about how to fit it all together into a coherent picture of the world. We don't make these choices in a random or arbitrary way. We make them in ways that allow us to advance our interests and further our goals and conform with our pre-existing beliefs. If we take that literature seriously, which we should, because there's just a ton of evidence about it, then we can see that there's actually not necessarily a tension between having an interest in believing something and believing it sincerely. In fact, what that literature would suggest is that if we have an interest in believing something, we'd be more likely to believe it sincerely, fervently, and to try to get other people to believe it too. And so, yeah, the argument of this book is absolutely not that symbolic capitalists are cynical or insincere. I think we're absolutely sincere and committed and all of these things. In principle, in practice, though, is where the rubber meets the road. What I argue in the book is that kind of the fundamental tension that defines the symbolic professions, that has defined a lot of our professions from the outset, is that on the one hand, we do have these sincere commitments to egalitarianism, but that's not our only set of sincere commitments. We're also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think that our voice should count more than the person checking us out at the grocery store, that our perspectives, that our values, that our priorities should weigh more heavily than those people. We think that we should have a higher standard of living than the people delivering our packages from Amazon, and we order Amazon it to everything to our door. We want our children to reproduce our own social position or to do even better than us. And these two sets of desires, both sincere, the desire to be an elite on one hand and to be an egalitarian on the other, they're in fundamental tension. You can't actually be an egalitarian social climber, right? It's a contradiction in terms. And so what I argue in the book is that what often happens when these two sincere commitments come into conflict, as they often do, is it's the desire to be an elite that ends up winning out and kind of transforming how we pursue social justice. So we end up trying to pursue these egalitarian social justice goals mostly in ways that don't require us to change anything, to sacrifice anything, to risk anything. In fact, our big fantasy, our kind of, from the beginning of our profession, has been basically how, like, if we could just tax Elon Musk hard enough, if we could just tax him hard enough, we could solve all the world's problems. And there's a couple of problems with this. I'll just say one problem, and then I'll stop talking, because I feel like I've been talking for a while. One of the problems with this approach is that it's actually kind of tough to just take from Elon Musk and give to people who need it. There are now, it's a little bit, direct transfers are a little bit more possible. We have platforms like Give Directly and stuff like that, but they're not used by the government. And so what ends up happening usually is that we take from the rich. In fact, I'll make it less abstract. I'll get super concrete. So at the beginning of the knowledge professions, at the beginning of the time when the symbolic professions came into their own, there were two big social transformations that happened at once, huge ones. First, the federal government passed the income tax and successfully defended it in the Supreme Court, allowing them to tax the Gilded Age elites in a way that they never could before. Second, you saw the creation of big philanthropy, philanthropy as we understand it today in a recognizably modern form, big philanthropy. As a result of these twin developments, there was this massive transfer of wealth downwards, from the Gilded Age elites downwards. So far, sounds great. Okay. But where did the money go? As Randall Collins shows in his book, The Credential Society, the main wealth transfer that actually occurred to this point at that period was from the rich to the upper middle class. Symbolic capitalists took from the rich and we gave to ourselves. And then there were some programs that were created. There were some ways in which ordinary people were better off. After we had our fill, we kind of sprinkled some on the peons to make sure that they didn't starve to death. But like the extent to which they benefited, given the sheer amount of wealth that was transferred down, the extent to which ordinary people benefited, and especially the most vulnerable in society benefited, was pretty marginal compared to the sheer amount of wealth that was transferred down. And this has actually been a perennial problem. And so, like, I think we should tax the billionaires more. But like the problem, but like in terms of setting expectations, one problem. I would think we should tax the billionaires more, because if we tax the billionaires more, that's going to be more money in the pockets of people like myself in the institutions I'm involved with. But in terms of like, to what extent will taxing the billionaires more actually help the marginalized and the disadvantaged in society? Well, that's pretty contingent on whether or not we behave in a completely different way than we've behaved in previous episodes when we've done things like this.
Yeah, and I'll just give a different example related to this. I mean, most people in Princeton receive way more housing assistance than anyone in Trenton through the mortgage tax deduction. And so if you look at the amount of money that a Princeton household would get from the federal government in the form of a tax break, it far exceeds the poorest person in Trenton and what they're likely to get. And this would be an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about. I'm going to move to the audience, but I'll just note that you presented this as two separate things, but actually in the book, and to get a little bit maybe pedantic, it's more of a dialectical thing. And by dialectical thing, I mean that the two aren't that separated from one another. It's actually not, the argument is not just that the symbolic capitalists are consuming these things in their own interests, but they're also increasingly dependent upon service workers.
Yes.
And the poor position of those service workers in order to satisfy their own consumption needs, in order to satisfy their standards of living. And so that the low, the low wages that Amazon delivery people receive are in fact low wages so that we can have.
They're subsidizing our fast and free shipping
through those wages. And so I think it's also, the argument goes further than I think what you said, and I don't mean to correct you on your own book, but I was Musa's dissertation advisor, or one of them, at Columbia. So, but I think it's a little bit more of an indictment than that, and I think it aligns a little bit with what my colleague Matt Desmond has written in Poverty by America about our own implication, even as we advance the language of social justice in the poor standard of living of all of these people that we purport to speak for.
Yeah, our lifestyle and social position is deeply bound up with exploitation, with exclusion, with exacerbating and exploiting and perpetuating a lot of these inequalities we condemn. Absolutely.
So I'd like to open it up to you all. Questions from the crowd, from the community, and do you want me to take Q&A and then you can just answer? So yes, please. And there's a microphone just as for the conversation. Yeah.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sylvia. I'm a second-year master's student in public policy, about 2 months from graduating, so about to become one of these people. And I'm hearing kind of like a tension here between the individual and the structural inequalities that we have built in. I think the first half of the conversation, I was like, okay, we're talking about the individual, and then we started talking about income tax and low wages and reliance on service sectors, which we may think need to be addressed kind of at like a higher structural level. So I just wonder how you think about that, and like what individuals can be doing, give directly, for example, versus like what kind of structural things need to happen, and how this class of people should be contributing to those issues on a individual and structural level.
Yeah, so as a bit of a spoiler, one thing that I don't do in the book is provide like, here's my top 5 policies, or like, here's a checklist for effective social justice advocacy. I don't do that for a couple reasons. One, because it seemed like a non sequitur a little bit to me to spend like 300 pages looking at the history and political economy of the knowledge professions and then conclude with like a checklist of effective, like I just didn't see the natural, like it just seemed like a bizarre transition. But also I'm like deeply, okay, I'm going to say this as kind of non-inflammatory as I can. There's kind of a desire in some symbolic capitalist spaces to have someone like me become like a secular priest for anxious liberals, to kind of provide them guidance on how to. And I really, 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 really don't want to occupy that role. And so I declined. But I think this question about what to do and how is important. And the book definitely will raise those questions in people. I think that, and I wanted readers to wrestle with those questions. But I won't just leave you completely hanging there, because Shamus also asked a question that I didn't. Yeah. So in chapter 6, great. So in chapter 6, I explore this in greater detail, this kind of tension between the individual and the structural. And I think, oftentimes sociologists, we tend to favor the structural stuff to the extent that we basically don't consider individual actions and behaviors at all. And in fact, we often appeal to the structural stuff to justify how basically we don't have to change anything. We shouldn't have, individual sacrifices really at the end of the day, it's just a drop in the bucket. It's just meaningless. So I guess the only thing I can do is just continue to live my elite life and feel bad and flagellate myself every once in a while. But, just continue to enjoy my elite life because, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. And I think, this kind of a move, when the structural account goes too far, it becomes something like a cop-out. And it also becomes this distortion of reality. So the structural account, as I emphasize in that chapter, it's important, it's valuable. I mean, I'm a sociologist for a reason. But it's also the case that we also do have agency. We have, we're all born into circumstances that are not of our making. We all have constraints and so on, but we do have choices that we can make, things that we can do differently from what we're doing that actually would make a difference for other people. And in fact, as symbolic capitalists, as elites, we actually have a lot more agency than most people. And how we choose to exercise our agency actually has much more significant impacts for other people than is the case for others. And so one of the things that I wanted to encourage maybe people to think about more was to think about the things that are within your control. And okay, I'll make it a little bit more concrete and then I'll stop talking. So for instance, it's not possible for you to end racism. You're not going to end racism. It doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to end racism. But it is absolutely possible for you to change someone's life, to go into, to find an actual concrete person who lives here in the community and change their life in all sorts of ways, right? And so one of the things that happens a lot of times when we focus too much on these cosmic struggles and not enough on helping actual people solve concrete problems in specific contexts in the real world is that we can end up over-focusing on and we kind of adopt this kind of cynical mindset and this kind of hopeless, this hands-off, okay, well, we can't, we're not going to end racism, so guess I'll just have to continue living with my racially exploitative lifestyle. So those aren't, as Shamus said, those aren't the only two options. Right? Like there's a whole range of, and so yeah, I explore that tension a lot more in chapter 6, and I really do want readers to kind of wrestle with that. And so the book, this tension that you picked up on, you picked up on it well, and it's something that the book kind of, it's a dialectic the book plays with throughout too.
Yes, please, in the front row. And just if you would mind waiting till the mic, and then I'll go back there.
Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. I guess it would be simple, from my perspective, to address the problem by creating a democracy that was a social democracy, not socialism, a social, meaning everybody would have access to education as far as they wanted to go, housing that was decent, and whatever else you need to live a decent life. And I think that we have probably elected a person who's going to really destroy whatever we had that was helpful to people on the margin. So, however, I do think there has been progress, despite what you're saying. In the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, I have seen, and I'll specify this by talking about American Blacks, such incredible growth in recognition and presentation in every form, acting, in athletics. I mean, amazing. And with that, maybe self-consciously or not, magazines like Glamour, like Vogue, there was a point where I didn't see one white model in there. This is a good thing. A lot of people resented that, but it is a good thing because presence of people who have not succeeded before and now are right in front of you doing well is a very good thing. And I think that's continuing. And these are people who may have been poor. Often they talk about growing up very poor, and they've made it. And this is wonderful.
I mean,
so, yeah. I mean, the problem with the capitalism, period, is that after World War II, it really exploded. And consumerism with it, and everybody had to have another car and another house and this and that. And so that has continued to grow. That did not affect the people who really needed the help, but it affected people who could manage 2 jobs, nobody's at home, the kids are by themselves because everybody's making more money.
Well, the kids aren't by themselves. The kids, the way that, one of the things I stress in the book is that the way a lot of professional households have one of the things that you see in a lot of professional households, like around here, is you usually have 2 people that have 6-figure jobs. And in our circles, we usually try to emphasize growing number of female professionals who earn like, solid incomes and stuff as a story of progress in feminism. And there's a sense in which it is. But it's also important to kind of think about how has this happened? So one thing you might think is, well, what happened is the men got a lot more egalitarian, especially in these professional circles. Men are especially likely to identify as feminists, and so maybe they're chipping in, they're doing more around the house. There's kind of equal division of domestic labor. That's not the case. That's kind of quantifiably, empirically not the case. There's been some change there, but not a lot. The main way that professional families are able to have this kind of dual income household is that they hire other women, mostly poor, non-white immigrant women, to do the women's work. So other women take care of the children, other women clean the house, other women cook the food, other women take care of the elderly and the pets and so on. And the ways that they can earn a salary, like in principle, if you were hiring all of this extra help, then the second salary wouldn't earn you much. You'd be spending most of the second salary would be spent on hiring these other women to do this other work. And so the way you can make a profit on this dual earner model is to basically shaft those domestic workers, to pay them very little. So it's like by exploiting other women is how professional women enjoy this kind of feminist dream. And the thing is, so for instance, this is a great case of this agency thing. So in New York City, in Manhattan, the Upper West Side, where I lived when me and Shamus were doing Columbia together, you saw a lot of families that hired immigrant women to take care of their children. And the question is, well, why? And the answer, the reason why they hired these immigrant women was because they could pay them a lot less and demand more of them and treat them worse than they would be able to treat a native-born citizen worker who would demand higher wages, who would be more demanding, who could talk back to them in different ways. And of course, there's no law that says if you hire an immigrant worker, you have to pay them less and treat them worse. That's not even a law it's not like the market. If you hire someone who's not a citizen, you have to pay them less. That's a choice people make. They could do otherwise. Instead, we target people who we know are desperate and vulnerable, and we intentionally pay them a lot less than we would pay another worker. This is a series of choices we make. We're not powerless here. This isn't the result of the market or capitalism or something like that. That's a choice of active decisions that we make to go out and target desperate and vulnerable people, fold them into our households, and shaft them on wages. Those are choices, and we can make different decisions. And so this is one of these places where kind of agency and structure kind of intertwine. But this point about there being progress, you're absolutely right. I mean, like at the time my father was growing up, my father is African-American, segregation was a thing, actual segregation, not like Confederate statues traumatizing me kind of problem, but like legal, formal segregation was very much a thing. And so like the kind of life that I live and the kind of opportunities and stuff open to my children would have been hard to believe of people of my father's generation. Immense progress. And in fact, one of the things I find kind of insulting about the kind of pessimistic narratives that prevail in some circles of the academy to pretend that nothing has changed and so on is, I feel like if anything, it's kind of does a disservice to the immense sacrifices and risks that people of my father's generation put to make these changes that actually did. There's been a lot of continuities, though, as well. Last thing I'll say on the symbolic, on the fact that there are more women in corporate boards and more non-whites in magazines and journalism and so on. Here, too, I agree. There's some value in that. But I think the amount of benefit is maybe less than people sometimes assume. So for instance, take corporate boards. There's now more African Americans, there's more women on the board of Goldman Sachs, things like this. Now, in order to be considered for the board of Goldman Sachs, you have to have graduated from an Ivy League school, had a really illustrious career at some of the top firms. you're probably a multimillionaire or a billionaire to even be in the pool of people who would be reasonably considered for the board of Goldman Sachs. And so the fact that there are now more black millionaires and billionaires and women who are millionaires and billionaires who are being considered for these board positions, like, that's not bad, but it also isn't really like meaningful for the genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged in society. Nothing for them has changed because some millionaires and billionaires can now get these positions that they couldn't before. And the same thing is true to an extent for outlets like the New York Times. So I talked about earlier today, when you look at the composition of journalism, about almost all journalists today have college degrees. And as college degrees have proliferated, where you get a degree from matters more and more. So in media outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New Republic and so on, they tend to have higher concentration of Ivy League graduates than like the House of Representatives or the Forbes 500 list. These are extremely rarefied spaces. And so the fact that we are creating more positions for Black graduates of Princeton and Harvard is not bad, but like, I definitely think it's not bad. Me of all people recognize the value in that. But also the extent to, again, the extent to which it benefits kind of normie Black people, people like George Floyd and so on, is pretty marginal. So I think it's like important to kind of walk in.
We have like 2 more minutes and one last question.
Okay, so I think it's
maybe no questions.
Okay, so I think it's important to walk and chew gum, to both kind of recognize this progress, which is important and substantial in some arenas, but also to recognize the extremely limited nature of a lot of these symbolic changes.
It's inspirational.
One last question.
Yeah, if we can be very quick with the question and the answer.
Message received.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a quick question, but I was actually just struggling with your central construct of the, what was it, symbolic capitalists? I mean, it just seems like such a capacious construct. I mean, I can think of people who fit this idea of being part of the knowledge economy. I can see the disjuncture, right, between the people who are social justice advocates in this role and the fact that they are, privileged in the hierarchy. But I can see people who also fit this criteria who very happily support the hierarchy. And I can think of people who fit this criteria who are data-driven. Like if I think about the New York Times, like John McWhorter, not so much data-driven. I would argue very much in supportive of the hierarchy, right? But if I would think about Charles Blow, he does read nationally representative data when he wrote his columns. So I don't understand, like, who exactly are you talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll quibble about, well, actually, I won't quibble about Blow because we're short on time. But okay, but it's definitely true that symbolic capitalist is a capacious term. That's partly by design. That's a virtue. So some of the ways that other people have conceptualized symbolic capitalists, they've also been known as kind of the creative class, the professional managerial class, a lot of classy terms. I was dissatisfied with a lot of these other formulations in part because this elite constellation really isn't a class in the traditional sense. There's actually a lot of heterogeneity economically within what other people have called the professional managerial class or the creative class. And in fact, there's usually this big divide within most of these professions between one group of people who have a really, really high level of autonomy, prestige, pay, and then another group of people who have much less of all of those things. In academia, for instance, think of the divide between tenure-line professors and adjuncts. Okay. And so they do have these overlapping interests. One of the reasons why it makes sense, though, to talk about them in as a coherent elite structure, despite this difference, which occurs throughout the professions, is that in terms of things like where they live, how they live, their voting, things like that, a lot of things that we would normally think of class shaping how you vote. It turns out the adjunct professor and the millionaire superstar professors, they actually vote the same way, basically, and they live in the same kinds of communities, and they live pretty similar lifestyles, although the millionaire guy gets even fancier fancy clothes. And one of the things that's important to note is that even the exploited, so there are symbolic capitalists, the people on the low end, I would feel comfortable discussing their situation as exploitation because their relatively low social position is what enables the people at the high end to enjoy their even. So I think it's useful to understand these as being an exploited elite formation, but they are still elites. And so one of the things I show in the book is that if you look at, say, contingent faculty members, it's the case that contingent faculty members relative to tenure-line faculty members are exploited, they have lower pay, prestige, and so on. But that's compared to tenure-line faculty members. Now, when you compare them to ordinary workers, they actually, full-time contingent faculty members in the United States tend to have significantly higher pay individually than the median household income in the United States. And on top of that, we have really flexible, and I'm speaking as someone who was a contingent faculty member until I got canceled by Fox News. That's a whole side story. But we have a lot more autonomy, better working conditions, better pay, and so on than normie workers. And this is part of why a lot of people who are adjuncts, who are contingent faculty members, choose to become contingent faculty members rather than working at Walmart or Waffle House or something like that, because we implicitly understand that one of those kinds of jobs would be a real job where we have a boss and we wear a uniform and we don't have a lot of autonomy in how we structure our time, and we would have a lot less prestige and things like this. And so for a lot of people, they would rather be a contingent faculty member at UC Berkeley than to be a manager at Waffle House. And so I think so there is this kind of heterogeneity, but it also does make sense to talk about them as an elite formation in a coherent way. And I unpack that a little bit more in chapter 3 of the book, Final Answer.
I was going to say 3. I hope you join me in thanking Musa for such a wonderful presentation.
Great questions.
And please buy the book.